Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are. And welcome to this ABS webinar on leadership, getting started. My name is Palena Neale, and I'm one of the professors here at ABS, as well as a leadership coach for professionals around the world. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about leadership. Why does leadership matter? Why does it matter at the global level? Why does it matter for you? We're going to look at what leadership means, particularly in the context of so much leadership information out there. We're going to look a little bit about leading. What do we lead? How do we lead? And then, of course, we're going to talk about you. What's important for you in your leadership as you advance in your career. And of course, there's going to be time for questions and answers. I'm going to be asking you a series of questions throughout the webinar. So I'd like you to jot them down and be sure to put them in the chat section as we move forward. So let's get started. The first question I want you to think about is, why does leadership matter? Don't overthink it. Just think about the question, almost like a word association, and jot down some responses that we'll come back to in a second. So if we look at why leadership matters, arguably there's a number of reasons. Governments, organizations, communities, and individuals are all for the most part aware that we need to be working towards better and more sustainable future for all, and that leadership is an integral part in making that happen. So if we look at leadership at the macro level, in terms of why it matters, we know that leadership is important for creating healthy environments, a vibrant economy, and an equitable society. On the political side, we know that political leadership is responsible for creating, managing, sustaining equitable societies, and also building strong and healthy institutions that are really the backbone for a prosperous and healthy society. And this, you'll recognize, is embodied in the Sustainability Development Goals, or Agenda 2030, where you have nation states and private sector working together to try and make these goals a reality. Similarly, at the organizational level, you have organizations where they need leaders to set a vision, to mobilize employees around creating that vision, and ultimately to achieve organizational goals. And we know that leadership is very important for achieving organizational performance, for setting direction, and of course for shaping the culture within an organization. So that's a little bit about leadership at the macro level, looking at societies, nation states, and also organizations. But what does leadership mean for you? For you, maybe somebody who's at the early outset of your career, getting started, or maybe advancing through the hierarchy. So I asked you earlier, what does leadership mean for you? And we'll come back to this question. And I'm guessing that some of what I'm going to talk about is also some of the things that you've mentioned as well. So we know, for example, if we start off by thinking about leadership from an individual perspective, all of us are responsible for leading. At an individual level, we have a role to play as a leader in our own life, which is likely to actually change and grow at different ages and stages of our life. Whether it's, for example, in high school or lycée, where we're leading, for example, a sports team or a debate team. When we go to university, we go to university and we see, for example, leadership happening of work groups and teams. We also see leadership happening when we move into an organizational setting. How are you going to lead within the context of your career? And then also on a very personal side, perhaps you're going to be leading a parent association or leading within the context of your religious affiliation. So leadership really does affect us all at the individual level. We also know that leadership is a very important skill in today's job market. And contrary to popular belief, leadership really is a skill that can be learned and developed. The current research has come out affirming that it is very, very much something that can be learned and developed as we go through our career. And I think it's also important to note that, a recent body of research has also demonstrated that approximately 30% of the variance in leadership role occupancy, only 30% maximum, is due to genetic disposition, and the rest, meaning possibility of 70%, is really down to environmental factors, meaning that each and every one of us have a tremendous opportunity to grow and develop our leadership skills. We also know that leadership is very important for career advancement and also for leadership transitions. And I think what's important to highlight here is that when we are advancing in our careers, certainly in the earlier days, we tend to focus on the technical skills, our training, we call on that. But as we advance through the hierarchy, those skills become less and less important. And as we start managing teams and leading teams, what becomes significantly more important are the people, interpersonal and leadership skills that you bring. And it's often these competencies that are extremely important in differentiating candidates. So when you are able to develop these skills, that certainly does give you a competitive advantage in the job market. The other point I want to mention is around expectations. And this is something that I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with, but we're certainly going to spend a second talking about it now. What I'd like to say around expectations are two things. We know, for example, that leadership has evolved over the last 30 years, and it's very much now a leadership that's focused on influence versus being rooted in authority. And that's a very important distinction, because when leadership is conceived as influence, it opens the possibility and it opens the space for leaders to emerge from very many different parts. It, number one, allows for informal leadership to be incorporated. It also allows for leadership to be demonstrated by people who are able to influence. And you've often heard of that the expression, I'm sure, leading from any level. When it is based in influence, it does mean that we have more leadership possibilities available to us. We also know that we have a very collaborative work environment, and this means working in groups, working in cross-functional teams, and the ability to lead and manage this kind of diversity and cross-functionality has become an extremely important skill that employers are looking for, and it's something that certainly people who are embarking on their career or already fully immersed in their career need to make sure that they have the capacity to do this if they are interested in advancing. So this idea means that a lot of employers actually have this expectation that in addition to your technical skills, you're also able to lead as well. Sorry, I have the slides keep jumping on me. The other point I want to mention is around timing. And I think what I want to say here is that this is a wonderful time to be thinking about your leadership, specifically if we consider the demographics that we're faced with. And we know that approximately 75% of the workforce by 2025 is going to be composed of millennials, not to mention Gen Zs. So we're going to have a much, much younger workforce. Contrast that with an aging population around a number of different societies, not just in Europe and North America, but a number of Asian societies as well. And so we know that this is, this demographic shift combined with the fact that there does consider to be a leadership dearth means that there's a lot of opportunity for leadership to be exercised. There's a lot of leadership opportunity available to us as organizations, have responded by indicating that they feel that their leadership, in general, their leadership pipelines aren't sufficiently ready for this transition, meaning that there is opportunity for you. So, what do we mean by leadership? Now you might be thinking, okay, we've been talking about leadership for a few minutes. Why is she bringing this up now? Well, I'd like to start off by trying to answer that question by sharing with you a statistic. And I am not sure how many of you will immediately recognize this statistic, maybe none of you. But I invite you to do a Google search on leadership. Just type in leadership into the Google search engine and you'll find that you get over 2 billion hits in less than a minute. And I illustrate this to bring a couple of important points to your attention. We are being bombarded with leadership literature. All you have to do is look at your LinkedIn feed or your Twitter feed, and you will see countless articles on leadership, how to be a leadership, how to be a leader, how not to be a leader, what you should do, the type of leader you should be. We actually have so much information out there right now on leadership that in itself can actually be problematic and arguably intimidating, not only to new leaders, but also to very experienced leaders. And at this point, I'd like to share an anecdote from my coaching practice. As I mentioned, I do a lot of leadership coaching for very seasoned professionals who are interested in developing their leadership. And one of the things that they actually highlight is how to navigate this tremendous amount of information that is out there. What do they pay attention to? What do they let go? Who are the leading authorities on leadership? So it is important to try and make some sense of actually what's out there. And so on that note, I'd like to share with you what I consider to be a really powerful definition of leadership, powerful in its simplicity. And I'm referring to the work of Gary Uckel, a leadership scholar. And basically what he's saying is, in essence, leadership is a process by which we influence others towards the achievement of some sort of common goals and objectives. And what you can take from that is leadership is a process. It's anchored in influence versus authority. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's about followership, bringing others along. And of course, it's towards some ends, some common goals and objectives. So I think that's a good place to start about what we mean by leadership. And again, I guess I want to make the point about how important influence is when we're talking about leadership by sharing another observation by Kenneth Blanchard. Some of you may be familiar with his very popular work in the 80s, where he wrote about the 1-minute manager, which was translated into many, many different languages all over the world. But here again, you have the essence, we have the contestation that leadership, successful leadership, is really based on influence and not authority, and that is a very important distinction. And I'm gonna switch gears and talk about that a little bit more in the context of how we've seen leadership change over the years, and where we are today in terms of leadership when we look at leadership. So what we might think of as a more traditional model of leadership is almost like a heroic white knight kind of leadership. And whilst that was certainly much more prevalent in the first half of the 20th century, I do want to make the point that it is still alive and well today. But what we see happening is the evolution of leadership in a different sense. So whereas we have the heroic model, it was very much built on this idea of a stable world, stable organization. There wasn't a lot of change, even stable work teams. Whereas now we're living in an environment, both globally and organizationally, of constant change. And I'm sure many of you are familiar, with the expression we're living in the VUCA environment, where we're constantly being bombarded with we're being bombarded and we're being asked to respond to change on both a macro and a micro level. Similarly, this heroic model of leadership was very much based on control, where the leader was in control. It tended to be very top-down. It was unidirectional, whereas now we talk about a leadership that is much more focused on empowerment and reciprocity. It isn't unidimensional in the same sense that it has been exercised. Similarly, this model, the heroic model, is much more rooted in a competition, the zero-sum game. And now we see a leadership that's very much based on collaboration and the ability to work together for better outcomes, focusing really on people's strengths. Similarly, we saw a leadership, it still exists, where there's much more uniformity, a homogeneous organization, homogeneous teams. And now we're looking at a leadership that is much more focused on diversity, diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, age, etc. And even though we certainly have achieved strides in diversity, I do want to make the point that it's important to note that we're not quite there yet. And if we talk about gender diversity, for example, we know that when we're talking about senior management, specifically the C-suite, that if we look at either the Fortune 500 companies or the S&P index, less than 5% of women are actually leading at that level. So we're certainly not there in terms of that kind of diversity. And if we look a little bit more generally at women in senior executive positions, we know that globally we only have about 26% of women holding senior executive positions. So whilst we have certainly made progress on the diversity agenda and how it applies to leadership, we still have more work to do. This heroic model of leadership tended to be much more self-centered, both in terms of the individual leader and how they exercise their leadership, and also the goals. It was very much focused on organizational goals. And when we're talking about a more contemporary expression of leadership, it tends to be rooted in a higher ethical purpose. We see much more organizational goals thought and conceptualized in terms of the global goals and more global agendas. So we see a sense of social responsibility even within the organizations themselves. So there's a much broader opening up of space and linking organizational objectives to larger purposes. And so again, it's very much this idea of what existed before was this heroic model, and what we're seeing now is a much more humble expression of leadership, where leaders not only start to share power and empower, but they're also sharing recognition, and you see that expressed through humility. So those are some of the big changes that we see happening in the leadership space in the last half century. And so what does all of that mean? And so I'd like to share with you what I think we can extract in terms of some principles if we try and extract the very essence of what leadership is. Leadership is really about positive influence. As we've heard, and we're going to hear a little bit more about this, it's really anchored in vision, being able to develop and communicate a compelling vision that brings others along. It's also about shared goals that everybody can relate to and connect to and see their contribution, and a leader's job is to facilitate that process. It's also about inspiring and being able to inspire your staff and your followers. And it's also about paying attention to those individuals in your team and in your organization. And that's what we call attention to individuals, and making sure you understand what their professional goals are. And it's also a part of a leadership role or responsibilities to help their followers grow and develop and achieve their professional goals as well. And that's a nuance that maybe we didn't see so much in previous years, and we see that as a fundamental aspect of leadership that we know today. So I'd like to share with you a few different types or different models of leadership that some of you might be familiar with. There's many, many more when we think of what's happening in the leadership space. But I chose these 5 to share with you today based on a couple of criteria. Number one, I think you might be familiar with some of them, maybe not necessarily the technical terminology, but you certainly will recognize the leaders who demonstrate this kind of leadership. And also because there is a significant amount of research to back up these kinds of leadership models versus some of the other leadership models that are floating around. So I want to quickly touch on some of these leadership models. The first one that I'm guessing many of you have already heard about is the transformational model of leadership. And here this is really about, it's a type of leadership, a model of leadership that is focused upon bringing about fundamental change and creating positive organizational outcomes. And how leaders do that is through the exercise of what's called the 4 I's, and some of you might be familiar with that. The first one is around idealized influence. And this is really about transformational leaders is when they act as role models and they display charismatic tendencies that tends to influence others and often inspires others to behave like. So these leaders actually serve as a role model and a referent, and often can inspire others to behave like them. So that's the first I. The second is around inspirational motivation, and this is really about motivating your employees, challenging them to do more, making sure that they understand that there are high performance expectations, and using that as a way to motivate your followers. And the third I is around intellectual stimulation. And this is very important. This is about challenging mental models, challenging the status quo, finding new ways of doing things, being disruptive, and really creating the space to experiment, to pilot, to fail, and creating that environment so that innovation can take place. And the last I that we talk about when we're talking about transformational leadership is really about individual attention. And I mentioned that earlier, and that's about understanding who your employees are. They're certainly not cogs in the wheel, that part of the machine, but understanding them as individuals and what their needs and wants are in a professional context, and how you as a leader can actually help facilitate them achieve their goals. So that's essentially what transformational leaders do. When we're talking about ethical leadership, what we're really talking about there is we're talking about leaders who constantly model ethical behavior. When we're talking about servant leadership, what we're talking about is a leadership that is really focused on, it has an other focus, both within the organization and a little bit more broadly. So I like to think about it as service above self. So these kind of leaders are focused really on how they can help their followers achieve their personal, professional goals, how they can work together beyond organizational goals to lead or to achieve larger goals within the organization and with society. And it's really this idea of thinking more broadly than specific, very narrow goals within the organization. When we think of charismatic leadership, probably won't surprise you to think about Steve Jobs. I think is a wonderful example of a very charismatic leader. And here what you have is a leader who is very concerned about articulating a vision that is actually like an idealized goal that is able to bring people along. People understand the importance of the vision and really want to get behind it, so that's an important component of being a charismatic leader. Charismatic leaders are often known for taking a lot of personal risk and don't necessarily shy away from it. They have a sensitivity to their followers as well. And probably one of the biggest distinctions between charismatic leaders and transformational leaders is that they often are seen to engage in unconventional behavior, novel behaviors that are counter to norms. They can be quite disruptive. And so that's what more or less characterizes a charismatic leader. And when we think of authentic leaders, again, I think many of you will already be familiar with this, but we're really thinking about leaders who know who they are, they know what they believe in, they have clear values, and they act on those values as they express their leadership. And they do so very openly and candidly. So there isn't a disconnect, or the disconnect between what they say and do is very narrow. So that gives you a little bit of a taste or a flavor for what leadership is and how it's conceived in our world today. And it also gives you a little bit of an introduction to the different kinds of leadership models that are out there. So what I'd like to propose now is that we shift gears again and we think about, well, what does this mean? So what does this mean for actually being a leader? And so for one of the first things I want to do in this part is I want to ask you to think about what do leaders do? What is it that leaders do? What's their job? And And again, word association, don't take a lot of time to think about it. Almost, I'd like you to think about it instinctively. And what we can see is leaders have to be the master of many roles. When you think of a leadership job description, it often tends to be like a very long shopping list. Leaders are involved, as I mentioned, in setting, jumping ahead again, they're involved in setting vision. They have a large role to play in terms of building trust. They're responsible for fostering and managing innovation. They have a considerable amount of work to do around motivating their staff and people in many different departments, their senior management as well. They're responsible for creating and managing change, initiating policy, perhaps creating and shaping culture or changing culture, designing structural design. They establish emotional bonds with their followers. They're responsible also for using their personal power, networking, mobilizing and leveraging resources, developing their followers, and ultimately delivering results. Now this is a brief summary of what leaders do, but it's just to give you an idea of the very many different tasks that they're involved in. And as you can probably start to guess, a lot of these aren't necessarily based on their technical skills that they might have started with X number of years ago. A lot of what they're being asked to do is really based on their personal, their people, and their leadership skills that they will have developed. So how do you actually do this? What does this mean? How do effective and successful leaders actually accomplish all of these goals? And how will you do this as you start or continue to move through your career trajectory? Well, we know that leaders are charged with building trust. And this is very important to determine the extent to which a leader is trusted and respected. They have to instill a sense of pride. They clearly have to work for larger purposes. It's not just about their self-interest. They have to work in a way that generates trust and also encourages respect. And they also have to display power and confidence. And we know that all of this is part of building trust. And we also know that this is a key ingredient in building followership. This is very much related to the next point about leaders acting with integrity. Now, this is an important part of being a leader, certainly in our contemporary society. And you can see some elements linking back to authentic leadership that we talked about earlier. Leaders need to be very open and transparent about what their values and beliefs are, both at an individual level and how those relate to the organizational core values. They need to be focusing on promoting a collective mission and purpose, and identifying how everybody fits and also can play a part in contributing to that. And leaders also need to play a role in promoting the moral and ethical consequences of decisions. And we know that when leaders act with integrity, this actually goes a long way in inspiring high standards and also promoting collective effort. So this is very key also in bringing people on board and bringing people along with you. Leaders also need to be very mindful about encouraging others, talking about, with optimism, about the ability to achieve goals and objectives and how this can be done. Clearly developing and articulating a compelling vision that contains with it the possibility to be achieved, and also making sure that they, at the same time, communicate the possibility that this can actually be done. It's not so far-fetched that it's never going to be achieved. And we know that when a leader does this, they encourage others, they express optimism, that this really helps people to believe in the possibility that their contribution is actually going to be in the service of something else. Leaders also have an important role to play in encouraging innovative thinking. And this is something that is very important in today's job market. Innovation. We know that this is not only it's not to some extent, it's a competitive advantage. And so the ability to foster an environment of innovation within an organization is a very critical key competency that leaders are expected to demonstrate. And this is really, again, coming back to creating the space, creating an environment where you are able to re-examine critical assumptions. You are able to express different perspectives. And you're encouraged to do so without fear of reprisal. So it's really creating the conditions for that to happen so that people are able to pilot, to innovate, to fail. You know, fail fast and fail often. You might have heard this expression. Is all important ingredients to creating an environment in which people are able to innovate and challenge the status quo. And we know, again, that this encourages high quality decision makings. Clearly it avoids groupthink, and it's critical in fostering innovation, which we know is an important element in organizational performance. We know also that effective leaders need to coach and develop their staff. And I just want to share an anecdote from my coaching practice, in the sense that many experienced leaders come for leadership coaching and have forgotten that it's an important part of their leadership responsibility to grow and develop their staff. And there is an expectation. Not only does it form part of what leadership is, but there's also an expectation on behalf of employees that good leaders do this. It's one of the ways that employees continue to feel engaged, and it's also another important factor for creating loyalty within the organization. So leaders need to, first of all, understand what their employees are interested in doing professionally. How would they like to grow and develop? And then it's part of their responsibility to teach, to coach, to mentor, and really to create more leaders within the organization. And again, when leaders do this, this goes a long way in contributing to both individual and team growth. I want to also share with you a final component that I'm going to share around what effective and successful leaders do. And this is a really important part of being a successful leader, and even getting to be a successful leader. And this is really about the importance of managing relationships. It's absolutely critical that leaders demonstrate organizational awareness, including an awareness of organizational politics. Regardless of whether you like it or not, you still need to demonstrate an awareness and know how to navigate it. And you also need to be able, as a leader, to know how to promote both you and your team's successes and accomplishments in the service of getting both recognition and also additional resources. If you want to be put up for new assignments, particularly those plum stretch assignments, and increase visibility of both yourself and your team, you need to be able to make sure that both your and your team's work is visible throughout the organization. And being able to manage these relationships, including managing your supervisors, this is very important for contributing to both individual and team recognition, and the team's ability to mobilize resources and opportunities throughout the organization. So, what does all of this mean for you? Think about that. I'd like you to think about what you've heard so far and how this might relate to you in terms of where you are in your career, and how this might be useful for you as you move forward. And what I'd like to propose is that there are actually a number of very important reasons for you to invest in your leadership. And the first one is really about developing these skills so that developing these leadership skills so that you're able to achieve both your own and your organizational goals. The second reason why it is very important to think about your leadership is so that you can lead with intention. It's not something that you do necessarily by chance, that you're actually taking some time out to articulate what you would like your leadership to look like. And how that relates to your personal values, your expectations. And this gives you not only authenticity, but it enables you to use your power to intentionally articulate who you are as a leader and how you show up as a leader. We know also that by investing in your leadership, this is an excellent opportunity to act very strategically and proactively, not only to navigate the strategic trends, such as the demographic trends, and how can you capitalize on that, particularly if you are an early or mid to career person. How do these demographic trends provide that opportunity for you to take advantage of what's happening? But also, developing your leadership skills also calls upon other skills, such as strategic planning, environmental scans, understanding how to negotiate. It allows you to take advantage of the market trends that will be important for you in your organizational context as you move forward. So it's giving you additional skill set that go beyond your technical capacities. And also, by investing in your leadership, this is an opportunity for you to strengthen the impact that you have as a leader. And I think ultimately that's what most people would like to do, not only as they exercise their leadership, but also in terms of what they leave as a leadership legacy. It's important to be able to have a certain amount of impact. And by investing in your leadership in a conscious way, that allows you to do that. And the final point I'd like to mention, and I think there's many, many different reasons, we could make this list very long, investing in your leadership is part of your continuous learning journey. And I think it's a very important point to make that effective and successful leaders are continually investing in their learning, and they're operating from a place of curiosity and continuous lifelong learning. And this is one of the factors that is separating effective and successful leaders from those who are less so. It's this commitment to continually learning and bettering themselves and improving and refining their leadership, particularly in this VUCA environment when things are changing so rapidly. So, on that note, I'd like to share some final thoughts with you. I'd like to close by saying that good leaders really inspire others to create healthy and prosperous institutions, societies, and organizations. Leadership matters for both us at a micro level and also for us at a macro level, our organizations and our society. So leadership matters to us personally and professionally. We also know that leadership is a skill that can be learned and improved. So it's available to all of us as a skill. And as I mentioned earlier, given that we think about leadership as influence, that opens a space for all of us to emerge as leaders, both formally and informally, based on our ability to influence others. And I want to mention that developing your leadership is a very important pathway for creating the future that you want. Not letting things happen by chance. Of course, you can take advantage of that as well. But by intentionally investing in your leadership, this is an opportunity to direct and to create the future that you would like to see happen. So, in terms of moving forward, I'd like to give you some questions to think about. I'd like you to think about, how do you currently lead? What is your leadership style? What does your leadership look like right now? How do you want to lead? What does your desired leadership look like? And this might change many times throughout your life, depending on where you are. What do you need to do now to get to the leadership that you would like to be? What do you need to do to be the leader that you would like to be? This is an important question. And then, very practically, what are you going to do to make that happen? What are the steps that you're going to take to actually make that happen? So I'd like to conclude by sharing with you what I think is a very powerful quote from Viktor Frankl. Some of you will have already seen this, but I think it really speaks nicely to the notion of choice and our freedom to be what we would like to be. Between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space lies our power to choose our response, and our response lies in our growth and freedom. And I think this is a wonderful way to summarize what we've been talking about, particularly around the fact that leadership space has been opened up by looking at leadership as influence, giving us all the opportunity and the possibility to lead. And so how are we going to use that space? How do we want to show up as leaders? And on that note, I'm going to stop. So I'm going to ask you to think about some of those questions that I've given you throughout the presentation, throughout our discussion. And I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for this, and invite you to continue to think about your leadership as you move forward. Thank you.